As the seas of the earth belong to the nations of the world, the story of St. Augustine is therefore the story of all men, of all nations. Blessed, cursed, plundered, destroyed, rebuilt, and reborn, St. Augustine, child of the sea, has endured for nearly 5 centuries, and to this day she remains the oldest continually occupied European settlement in the continental United States. Welcome to St. Augustine, Florida, the nation's oldest city. With a history firmly interwoven with the ambitions and the fates of many people and many nations, the story of St. Augustine cannot be told without including the early history of Florida. And that is where we will begin, a very, very long time ago. This familiar peninsula of land separating the Atlantic Ocean from the Gulf of Mexico, according to some geologists, wasn't even a part of the continent billions of years ago. Their claim is that a great trench in the ocean separated the mainland from steaming volcanoes. Many believe these volcanoes were later to be called the Caribbean Islands. Some evidence of that early volcanic activity can still be found today in southern Cuba. And it is possible that Florida may have been part of the Bahamas and Cuba before the development of the Florida Straits. Eventually, warm seas would have covered the volcanic bedrock just about the time that the dinosaurs were roaming the continent. Florida, it appears, was located just far enough to the south to have escaped the glacier activity during the Ice Age. In fact, it has been theorized that the glaciers consumed so much of the Earth's water that the finger of sand that we know as Florida was at one time nearly twice its present size. While the northern part of the continent was shrouded in ice, herds of animals migrated to this area in search of food. With the southern tip of Florida located only 1,700 miles from the equator, it was the warmth of the sun and the rain that beckoned the vegetation from the soil. The Ice Age gave way to centuries of heavy rainfall, so the theory goes. The result was that the sinkholes caused by the shifting seas in the brittle Florida limestone crust were bursting with crystal freshwater springs. The abundance of vegetation, the crystal springs, and the warmth of the sun, primitive villages were beginning to appear all along the banks of the St. Johns River by 5000 BC. They were populated by a race of tall, dark-skinned people with straight hair. The largest group of this aboriginal Florida culture were known as the Timucuans. They inhabited most of North Florida, and these would be the people who would encounter the first white men who stumbled ashore very shortly after Christopher Columbus changed the direction of history. Most historians credit this man, Don Juan Ponce de Leon, with the discovery of Florida. While he was governor of Puerto Rico, stories were circulating throughout the Caribbean of a fabulous fountain flowing with the waters of eternal youth. Whether or not it was in search of the truth of this legend or possibly dreams of the gold and silver which he thought he might find, Ponce de Leon charted a northwesterly course from Puerto Rico, March 3rd, 1513. Near Easter, a month later, on April 2nd, it was a time the Spanish called Pascua Florida, the Feast of the Flowers, when land was sighted. In honor of the Easter season, the land was called La Florida, and the name was applied to all Spanish possessions on the continent. Even though it was the Spanish who discovered and named Florida, it was really the French who first settled here. In 1562, an expedition under the leadership of Jean Ribault discovered the St. John's River, calling it the Rivière de Mai. 2 years later, Admiral of France Coligny dispatched René de Laudonnière to establish a fort near the mouth of the river, from which they might raid the Spanish vessels. Laudonnière and his French Huguenots established Fort Caroline, and for a time, it was the French fleur-de-lis that flew over Florida. News of the French fort reached King Philip II of Spain, and in retaliation, he dispatched his foremost admiral, Don Pedro Menéndez de Avalis, to drive out the French and establish a colony. You can see on this map the route followed by the Spanish treasure fleets. It is not difficult to understand Philip's position when you see how close they sailed off the Florida coast on their way back to Spain. In the summer of 1565, Menéndez set sail, and on September 8th of that year, he and his followers strode ashore to break ground for the new settlement, which he named after the saint on whose feast day he had first sighted the land. It was here, on the grounds of the mission of Nombre de Dios, that Menéndez, his followers, and Father Francisco Lopez de Mendoza Grajales celebrated Mass at what would become the first Catholic parish in the New World. Shortly after the Spaniards had established their foothold in St. Augustine, Menéndez proceeded to carry out the second phase of his mission. Proceeding north over land, he headed in the direction of Fort Caroline to eliminate the French. Meanwhile, unaware of the Spanish plan of attack, the French fleet put to sea in the direction of St. Augustine. Fort Caroline, thus, was now easy prey for the Spaniards. And here's what happened. Notice, if you will, the huge gate to the fort, and pay particular attention to the tiny gate at the bottom. Instead of opening the small gate, the French sentries opened the large one, and it was "Bonjour, Monsieur Menéndez," and in came the Spaniards. They encountered little or no resistance, and Fort Caroline, of course, fell. It was renamed San Mateo. The fate of the French fleet was similar. On the way to attack St. Augustine, the ships encountered a hurricane, and most of them were wrecked in the storm. About a month later, some of the French survivors were discovered south of St. Augustine. Without guards or provisions, Menéndez had no choice but to put the Frenchmen to the sword. The massacre took place here, near the inlet, which has been known ever since as Matanzas, the slaughters. The original site of Fort Caroline no longer exists, washed away when the river channel was deepened in 1880. Today, the fleur-de-lis flies over a reconstruction, a national memorial, administered by the National Park Service, United States Department of the Interior. Let's go inside, shall we? 16th century sketch by French artist Jacques Lemoyne, the fort walls were reconstructed near the original site on the St. Johns River plain. The French demi-culverin, seen here, was a popular field cannon of the 16th century. The brass cannon with carriage weighed nearly 2 tons. It fired an 8 to 10 pound shot. 14 of these demi-culverins were located at Fort Caroline. Unfortunately for the French, the Spanish attack was such a surprise that the massive cannons were as silent then as they are today. Located on Fort Caroline Road in Jacksonville, Fort Caroline National Memorial is open to the public. If actual colonization is a criterion of any nation's claim to land, then Spain's 1513 claim to North America, made within sight of what was to be St. Augustine, should have excluded earlier British claims. The colonial and religious history of our country began here on the grounds of the mission of Nombre de Dios 55 years before the Pilgrims stepped into history on Plymouth Rock. At an altar similar to this one, the first Catholic Mass was offered September 8, 1565. Following Father Francisco Lopez de Mendoza Grajales, the Jesuits set about their work of teaching the Indians about Christianity. Not at all an easy task with the Timucuans, who believed in sacrifices and mutilating their enemies. After several of their order were killed by a band of renegades, the Jesuits left Florida in 1572. Beneath a golden cross of sunlight, nestled among the live oaks, stands the shrine of Nuestra Senora de la Leche, established on these hallowed grounds circa 1602, the first shrine ever to be dedicated to the Virgin Mary in these United States. Resting adjacent to the shrine are 6 Sisters of the Congregation of St. Joseph, who arrived here in 1866 to open schools and teach the Christian doctrine. St. Augustine celebrated its 400th anniversary in 1965. The great cross made of stainless steel, rising 208 feet to the heavens, was erected then. It serves as a reminder to all who pass that Christianity in the New World began right here. Visitors to the mission grounds are invited to worship at the Prince of Peace Church, also built in 1965. Our nation's sacred acre, the mission of Nombre de Dios, is open daily. Visitors are encouraged to walk these picturesque, hallowed grounds and enjoy the tranquility. Menendez, the simple survival of his people was a daily reward. Early St. Augustinians found life quite different. The ability to make do with limited resources was a necessity. In St. Augustine's restored Spanish quarter, guides and craftsmen in period dress show you how the Spanish soldiers and the settlers lived their lives 250 years ago. The state of Florida's living history adventure, the Spanish Quarter, south of the city gate on St. George Street. This stone tablet on the shoreline of St. Augustine marks the site of the first fort, San Juan de Pinos, built by Menendez in 1565 and destroyed 21 years later in 1586 by Sir Francis Drake. It was only one in a series of 9 wooden forts offering protection for the inhabitants of the city. Here you see a replica of Drake's vessel, the Golden Hind, on a recent visit to the city. English pirate raid of 1668, Don Manuel de Sandoya, then governor of Florida, began construction on this stone fortress, the Castillo de San Marcos. The native shellstone coquina would be the basic material used in construction. Easily cut with a pick or an axe, when coquina is exposed to the air, it becomes quite rigid. Anastasia Island is all that remains of an old Spanish coquina quarry. This chimney and the well. It was from here that the shellstone was transported by barge to the Castillo construction site. Unloaded there, the stone cutters went to work shaping the coquina blocks as required. The Castillo was finally completed in 1695. And for 84 years, under the Spanish flag, this fortress thwarted all invaders. Even General James Oglethorpe of Georgia, who launched a massive 38-day attack in 1740, was repulsed. The layout of the Castillo featured watchtowers in each of the diamond-shaped corners. The terraplane, or gun deck, was built originally on wooden beams and boards laid between the outer wall and the courtyard wall. Outside, the fort was protected by a moat 40 feet wide. The earthwork wall seen here in reconstruction was called the Cubo Line. It extended westward to the San Sebastian River. The only entrance in that wall would have been through this gate. The coquina pillars, which you see here, were constructed in 1808 as replacements for time-worn wooden posts. The walls of the Castillo are 30 feet high. The exterior sides of the structure measure 302 feet between points of the bastions. Representative of Italo-Spanish fortification, the Castillo is not impregnable, although it has never been taken in battle. It was inside these walls during times of siege that the St. Augustinians sought shelter. Behind this door lay a welcome refuge, the chapel of St. Mark's, the altar of which is seen here. It surely seems as though the prayers of the St. Augustinians were answered, for throughout the Castillo years, the old fort remained seemingly invincible. What tales could be told if only the walls could speak? The quiet at times seems to be broken only with the cries of its captives. Osceola, chief of the Seminole Indians, was one of them. From a casemate just like this, so one story goes, Coacuchi, another Seminole, and 18 of his followers escaped to freedom up the wall and through the aperture 15 feet above the floor. In 1763, Spain gave Florida to the British in exchange for newly conquered Havana. Under the terms of the treaty in 1783, however, the Spanish returned a year later. For 235 years, the Castillo served the Spaniards well, preserving their dominion over Florida. Finally, in 1821, Old Glory greeted the sunrise over Matanzas Bay when Florida was admitted to the Union. Since 1924, the Castillo de San Marcos has been a national monument, maintained by the National Park Service Department of the Interior. The Castillo de San Marcos, now preserved by the people of the United States for the enjoyment of generations yet to come. Located 14 miles south of St. Augustine on Rattlesnake Island, near the site of the French massacre of 1565, is Fort Matanzas. Accessible only by boat, the fort was built by the Spanish in 1742 as an outpost to guard the city against enemy attack through the inlet to the south. The fort, as you can see, like the Castillo, is built of the native shell rock coquina. No battles were fought at this fort, but its very presence was enough to discourage would-be raiders. Fort Matanzas is now preserved and maintained by the National Park Service, United States Department of the Interior. More than 250 years ago, African-born slaves risked their lives to escape the English plantations in Carolina and find freedom among the Spanish living in St. Augustine. In 1738, the Spanish governor established the runaways in their own fortified town. It was called Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mosé. You are looking at an artist's conception of the fort, which was located in this area, about 2 miles north of St. Augustine. On the Jeffreys map of 1763, you can see the location, highlighted by the white square near the upper right-hand corner of your screen. The freedmen were welcome additions to the weakened Spanish military forces. Fort Mosé was, in effect, the first legally sanctioned free black town in the present-day United States. An archaeological and historical investigation is currently underway, headed by Dr. Kathleen Deegan of the Florida Museum of Natural History. Here you can see one of Dr. Deegan's students examining a dig on the site. Several artifacts have already been found, among them this handmade St. Christopher medal. Fort Mosé, the Black Fortress of Freedom in historic St. Augustine. The seat of government of Florida during the Spanish occupation is represented in this drawing. The residence dates to 1604, when it was purchased by the Spanish government for Governor Ibarra. The building fell victim to a fire when the British burned the town in 1702. A new structure was built between 1706 and 1713. The museum on the ground floor of Government House explores St. Augustine's colorful past with historical exhibits and artifacts from shipwrecks and archaeological digs. Government House today is headquarters for the historic St. Augustine Preservation Board. Opposite Government House is the Plaza de la Constitución, the plan for which was laid out in 1589 by decree from Philip II. At the east end is the public market, the birthplace of the standard system of weights and measures. At the south end of the city is the Gonzalez Alvarez house, known affectionately as the oldest house. Archaeologists have been able to show continuous occupancy of this site since the early 1600s. Tomas Gonzalez y Hernandez, an artilleryman at the Castillo, lived here with his family. The second story of the house was added during the British period by Mary Peavett. It was her life story that became the basis for the novel Maria by Eugenia Price. Geronimo Alvarez bought this house from Mary Peavett, and he and his family lived here for nearly 100 years. Finally, in 1918, it was purchased by the St. Augustine Historical Society. Opposite the oldest house on St. Francis Street is the Yambillas house, erected before 1763. It has undergone numerous modifications throughout the years. The restored first Spanish period dwelling is maintained by the Altrusa Club of St. Augustine in cooperation with the St. Augustine Historical Society. St. Augustine, it has been said, was discovered twice. Once by Pedro Menendez and the second time by this man, Henry Morrison Flagler, perhaps the city's greatest benefactor. A partner with John D. Rockefeller in what eventually became Standard Oil, Flagler's first visit to St. Augustine came in the winter of 1884. And during that visit, he stayed here at the San Marco Hotel. While he was visiting St. Augustine, Flagler met Franklin Smith, a Boston architect, who had built his winter home here, which he called Villa Zoreda. It was a scale replica of a portion of the Alhambra in Granada, Spain, and it was one of the first poured concrete structures in America. From Villa Zoreda, Flagler got the idea for his first hotel, the Ponce de Leon. Opened in January of 1888, it was considered the most luxurious hotel in the world, and it was, in fact, the first building to feature electricity in Florida. Many of the most prominent people in the country stayed at the Ponce, among them Presidents Cleveland and Teddy Roosevelt. And there was Sarah Bernhardt. There were the Rockefellers, the Whitneys, and of course, the Vanderbilts. Carrere and Hastings were the architects. Interior decor by Louis Tiffany. A year later, directly opposite the Ponce on King Street, the Alcazar welcomed its first visitors. A little more affordable than the Ponce, at the Alcazar, you could enjoy a room with 3 meals for $4 a night. The Alcazar was really a fabulous playhouse. Here you could enjoy the first steam bath in Florida. You could swim in what was, at the time, the world's largest indoor swimming pool. And there were tennis courts, and in short, just about everything anyone could ask for in terms of recreation, including a gambling casino. In operation until 1930, the Alcazar was a victim of the Great Depression. Otto C. Leitner, founder of Hobbies magazine, purchased the Alcazar and reopened it in 1948 as the Leitner Museum, featuring his collections from all over the world. In 1950, Otto C. Leitner was laid to rest in the beautiful courtyard of his museum. Built in 1885 by Franklin Smith, the Casa Monica Hotel was made of poured concrete just like his home, the Villa Zoreda. Located across the street from both the Ponce de Leon Hotel and the Alcazar, It, of course, took very little time for Smith to encounter financial problems. Of course, you know who bailed him out, don't you? Henry Flagler. The hotel was renamed the Cordova, and Flagler eventually installed a second-story covered walkway between the Cordova Hotel and the Alcazar. Flagler's association with St. Augustine was not limited to the hotel business. The son of a Presbyterian minister, Flagler in 1889 suffered the loss of his only daughter, Jenny Louise Benedict, when she died at sea on her way to St. Augustine. The following year, the Flagler Memorial Presbyterian Church was dedicated in her memory. Built in the shape of a Latin cross, the great copper dome rises 150 feet. It is topped by a 20-foot bronze cross. Also supportive of the Baptist congregation, in 1895, Henry Flagler gave them property near the Memorial Church to build their own. In exchange for property on which the Alcazar Hotel was erected, Flagler employed Carrere and Hastings and Louis Tiffany to build the Grace United Methodist Church. Flagler was also instrumental in rebuilding the cathedral after the disastrous fire of 1887. The clock tower to the west of the cathedral was a gift from Henry Flagler. In addition to his St. Augustine hotel empire, Flagler is actually responsible for development of the eastern seaboard of Florida while he was constructing his great railroad that went to sea along the eastern seaboard all the way to Key West. Flagler's hotel empire is still standing today at the corner of King and Cordova Streets. The Ponce de Leon Hotel is today known as Flagler College, a four-year liberal arts school. The Cordova Hotel is our St. Johns County courthouse. And this view is seen from the east tower of the Alcazar, today's City Hall and Leitner Museum. A true empire builder, Henry Morrison Flagler was laid to rest in 1913 here in the family mausoleum adjoining the Memorial Church. A close look at this picture of the Ponce de Leon Hotel in its heyday shows the horse and buggies in front of the hotel. They were operated by the St. Augustine Transfer Company, essentially a taxi service conveying passengers between the railroad depot and the hotel. When the automobile appeared on the scene, the carriages were converted to sightseeing vehicles. Today's visitors delight in riding with the open carriages through the narrow streets for which this city is so famous. One of the most prominent historic landmarks in the city is located across the Bridge of Lions on Anastasia Island. Built originally on the site of a Spanish watchtower in 1823, the present-day St. Augustine Light has been operational since 1874. With a beam reaching 19 miles out to sea, it stands 162 feet high, and it is the oldest brick structure in the city. Many of St. Augustine's historic treasures still await the visitor. In the restored district on St. George Street, there are numerous historical buildings and landmarks. Through this arch on Avali Street, in the heart of the historical area, the restored Spanish Quarters Military Hospital offers yet another look at 18th century St. Augustine. And it's only one in a series of historic sites all along this quaint, narrow street. Much of St. Augustine's historical heritage remains as yet undiscovered, but archaeological research continues to reveal additional facets of our legacy. Further historical information on St. Augustine can be obtained through the St. Augustine Historical Society or by contacting the historic St. Augustine Preservation Board. As St. Augustinians, we are proud of our history, our heritage, and our quaint ambiance. Our historical treasures are always yours to enjoy. Now, for the historic St. Augustine Preservation Board and the nation's oldest city, this is Bob Chambers speaking. As our founder, Don Pedro Menendez, might have said, hasta luego y vaya con Dios, mi amigos.